Welcome to Spruce Grove Alliance Church, your home.
Wow. Well, good morning, everyone. Today we are continuing our sermon series called Holy Listening, Hearing God's Voice in a Noisy World. And we have been in this series for a while, and we've been talking about how is it do we actually hear the voice of God. And one of the reasons we decided to do this series is because one of the most common questions that we get as pastors is, how do I know God's will for my life? How do I know when God is speaking to me personally? And Pastor Brent, in the first sermon in this series, he did a great job at laying out a foundation for hearing God's voice. He talked about the three spheres of God's will: his sovereign will, his moral will, and then, of course, his personal will. And that's so important for us to know, because when it comes to hearing from God, whenever he speaks to us, it's always going to be within his sovereign will and within his moral will. It's never going to be outside of that. However, as many of us know, if we've ever tried to follow God's will for our lives, there's going to be times in our lives where it seems as though there's many paths that we can choose, and all of those paths seem equally good. They all seem to be within God's sovereign will and within his moral will, yet we want to know which one of these paths we should take. And so we come before God and we say, God, show us, what is your personal will for me? What is your personal will for me right now in this situation? And this is a really great question. This is, like I said, the question we have been trying to answer through this sermon series. And it's something that, if you're anything like me, we've been struggling with. I've struggled with this a lot in my life, always personally doing lots of study and lots of practice trying to answer this question for my life. God, what do you want from me? And the reasons why people want to hear from God, it may differ a little bit from person to person, but for me, it was always quite simple. This is how I reasoned it. When I was a new Christian, I thought, the Bible is true, and the Bible tells me that our God is real, that he is alive, that he is a personal God, and that he speaks to us. He can speak to us personally, we can hear him, and guess what? He's a lot smarter than us, and he has our best interests at heart. So, if that all is true, the most important question and the most important skill that one can develop in their life has to be listening to God well. That has to be the most effective skill that one can develop. And although this is practically why I started this journey of trying to listen to God well, along the way, I found another great reason why one should choose to listen to the voice of God. And that is that to wake up every single morning and to say, God, what are you trying to say to me? God, what do you want from me today? That is an exciting, adventurous way to live the Christian life. Oh, it's so exciting. If that is your posture every single day, and you're always aware that God is at work around us and that he invites us into that work and he invites us into his will, if you realize that, then all of a sudden all these things that happen, these conversations, these interruptions, maybe these seemingly random events that come into our lives day to day, all of a sudden they're not meaningless, but they're pregnant with purpose, because you know that God is doing something. I was recently speaking to another pastor, and he told me about this guy he knows, and he always says to him, he says, I never pray for more than 5 minutes, but I never go more than 5 minutes without praying. And I thought to myself, that is a great way to kind of put this posture of ears open, always listening to God, every day saying, God, what are you doing? What are you doing in this situation? What are you saying to this person? What are you trying to say to me through this person? Where are you at work right now? To always be asking that question, that is an exhilarating, adventurous way to live every day with the Lord. Like, you may wake up like me every day with a plan for your day, but when you wake up also with this posture of, God, what do you want to say to me? It opens up possibilities, right? You got a plan, but you hold it a little bit loosely, and you're always open to what he has to say. So needless to say, I'm super excited for this sermon, because I really get to share with you a lot of what I've discovered on my own personal journey to hearing God's voice. Now, one of the most helpful sections in the Bible when it comes to knowing how do we actually hear God's voice has to be John chapter 10. Both Pastor Brent and Pastor Karen have touched on this passage throughout their messages, but I want to just focus on the first 6 verses today and just look at that and to unpack it a little bit in terms of what are the implications for our lives and what are the implications when it comes to hearing God's voice. So I'd love to just read to you God's word this morning. Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name, and he leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. So it says here, Jesus is using a figure of speech here. He's using a story, an illustration, a metaphor. And in this metaphor, who is the shepherd of the sheep? Well, it's Jesus. And actually, it also says later on in John that not only is he the shepherd, but he's also the gate. He says in John 10, he says, I am the gate for the sheep. And also, I am the good shepherd. So if Jesus is the gate, and if Jesus is the shepherd, who are we in this metaphor? Well, we are, of course, the sheep. As someone once said to me, we're his sheeple. And I thought that was funny. I don't know. I'm getting old, I guess. Dad jokes. But anyways, we're his sheeple, right? And who are the Pharisees? Who are the false teachers? Well, they are the robbers, and they're the thieves, the ones that climb in some other way and don't come in through the gate. And the first thing that we need to unpack here is in verse 3. And Jesus says this. He says, he calls his own sheep by name. He calls his own sheep by name. Do you realize how intensely personal that is? That the God of heaven and earth, the creator of everything, that not only does he know your name, but he calls you by name. Oh, that is powerful stuff right there. And this, I think, points out one of the most common hurdles and probably the first hurdle that needs to be overcome if we are to hear his voice. And that's overcoming this lie that we believe, that we can't actually hear the voice of God or he doesn't actually speak to us personally. And I've met, there's some churches, and I've met a lot of Christians that actually believe that he no longer speaks to us today, that we cannot hear him. And whenever I encounter someone like that, in a very loving way, I always challenge them from the Bible. Because it's common, I think, for us that if the Bible teaches something, and that something happens not to align with our culturally accepted norms, we tend to not want to believe that or challenge that. Is that really what he said, right? And in our culture, if I tell someone, even my non-Christian friends, if I say, I pray a lot, they think I'm some kind of saint. But if I say God talks to me back, well, now I've got schizophrenia, Now I'm taking crazy pills all of a sudden. And I always thought that was so strange how the cultural norm, it's acceptable to talk to God, but it's not acceptable to believe that he talks back. And I always thought that was so strange. But what does the Bible say, right? Because that really is the baseline of truth. It's bottom level truth here. I'll just summarize really quickly. In the Old Testament alone, it's estimated that God speaks personally to people about 2,000 times. That trend continues on into the New Testament. We've looked at some of those passages already in this sermon series. God is still a God that speaks. And he's a God that calls us by name. That is so personal. And I don't know if you've ever had to try to have a personal relationship with someone when it's just a one-way dialogue. Does that ever work? No, that's not a relationship, my friends. That's a dictatorship. Maybe that's a monologue. But that's not a relationship. Any real personal relationship requires two-way dialogue at all times, right? So we require this if we're going to have a deep personal relationship with God. And so that really is the first step, is that we have to reject this cultural lie that God does not speak to us and that we cannot hear him, and instead stand with assurance of faith that our God is a God who still speaks today and we can hear him. Now, the next point that I want to pull out from this passage comes to us from verse 1. Anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. See, this is saying something I think that a lot of Christians pick up on. And when I talk to a lot of Christians, they understand this very well, that there are multiple voices. There are other voices other than God that are speaking to us and are trying to lead us astray. Kind of like the story of a man who decided to go visit the Holy Land, so he went on a little trip there. He wanted to see the area where Jesus first walked this earth. And so he's on this tour bus, and he's going around the countryside, and he sees a shepherd, and he's leading his sheep. He's walking along, and the sheep are following closely behind him. And he thought, oh, that is so amazing. Now, a little while later, he sees another shepherd, and he's got this stick, and he's driving the sheep forward from behind. And so he turns to the tour guide, and he says, what's going on here? Why is this shepherd driving him with the stick? And the tour guide kind of gives a bit of a chuckle, and he goes, oh, that's not the shepherd. That's the butcher. Right? See, my friends, there are other voices, and this is what makes listening to God so difficult sometimes, is because we know that there are other voices that are seeking to speak to us, to have us listen to them because they want to lead us to the slaughter. There's lots of different sources where these voices can come from, of course. They can originate from the enemy, right? He's the father of lies. He's always speaking to us, puts temptations in our minds, put thoughts into our head, tries to corrupt Scripture and lead us away from the Lord. There's our own sinful desires that speak to us that can be very convincing. There's false teachers and false influencers that are influencing us that are not from God. And there's, of course, our cultural values and belief systems that we've inherited, or even our own upbringing, our own background. And so the logical question then is, if there are multiple voices out there, and they are speaking to us, seeking to lead us astray, how do we identify God's voice from their voice, right? And you know what? This is the most, hands down, the most common question that I get asked when it comes to the topic of listening to God. How do we tell the difference between the different voices? So, without further ado, let's dive into that, and I want to answer that question right now. Jesus says, verse 4, they know his voice. The sheep know the shepherd's voice. He's the shepherd, we're his sheep. We can know his voice. Now, what's interesting is it doesn't say that we'll hear his voice amongst many other voices but not be able to tell the difference. No, it says we will know his voice. And this Greek word that we translate as know, it means to know something or someone in an intensely personal way, like a multifaceted way. Kind of like in English how we would say, I know my spouse, or I know my mother or father, I know my best friend. Just like we know someone, so in the same way we can know God. And so in a lot of ways, the ways that we can identify the voice of someone we love is the same way and same principles by which we can identify the voice of God, whose voice we know and who loves us and cares for us personally. And this actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. And there's techniques and ways that we hear people's voice that applies here. Like, for example, I know my wife's voice very well. And I could describe it to you, but it would probably be inadequate. Like I could tell you, what does her voice sound like? It sounds light, it sounds joyful, it sounds feminine, it's sweet, it's humorous, it often makes jokes, it's encouraging. I could tell you these things, but if you're armed with just this description, would you be able to pick out her voice in a crowd? Chances are probably not. But I can pick out her voice in a crowd. Why? Because I've been listening to her for half my life. I know her, and I know her voice, just as verse 4 says, we can know the shepherd's voice. I know it intimately, right? But sometimes that's actually one of the issues, is that we try to substitute this arduous work of actually developing a deep personal relationship with God, and we try to substitute it with cheap tips and tricks, and people go, so how do I actually, I just need to know the answer. I just need to know what God wants, right? I need to know what is the right decision. So just give me some tips and tricks, Pastor. But they try to circumvent this deep work that needs to happen to actually cultivate this personal relationship with God. But of course, that's a whole nother sermon series, how to cultivate a personal relationship with God. So let's go into this discussion just assuming that that's you, that you already have that you're one of his sheep, that he's your shepherd, that you have a personal relationship with Jesus. If that is the case, how do we practically identify his voice? Well, if I need to know what my wife's voice sounds like, or if there's a crowd of people, what I can do is I can think back to a time when she spoke to me, and I can observe it, and I can hear it, like in my mind and in my heart, I can hear it, and I can identify the aspects of it, and I can look at it and how it differs from other voices, right? And the same thing goes with our relationship with God. Here's a great little technique. You can try this sometime. You don't have to try it now. But think about a time when God spoke to you, like where you knew he spoke to you. And most Christians can identify at least one time in their life. So go back to that place. And what did that voice sound like? What were the qualities of that voice? How did that voice, God's voice, how did that sound different than my internal voice? How did that sound different than the voice of temptation? Or the voice of my upbringing? How does that sound? Go back there, retrace your steps, go back in your memory, and remember what it sounds like. It's kind of like this. Sometimes you hear a song, and you love the song. You're like, oh, this song, it's a great song. I love this song. But you can't, you can't remember the band or the song name, or you can't remember enough of the lyrics to be able to look it up. But you really want to find this song because you want to add it to your playlist. You want to listen to it. And so you kind of hold it in your heart and in your mind, and you carry it around with you. And you know what it sounds like, but to describe it, isn't enough to figure it out. And then all of a sudden, you hear it. Like one day you're driving and it comes on the radio, and you're like, yes, that's the song. That's what paper, pen, let's go. I want to write down these lyrics. Like, I want to look this up again. And this actually happened to me this weekend, this exact thing. And I was like texting Lacey, like, what's the name of that? And she's like, I don't know. And then I heard it, and I was like, yes, that's the song. That's what it's like listening to God's voice. You remember a time when you were so certain he spoke to you. You carry that in your heart, and then you're tuned into it so that when he speaks again, you're like, yes, that's it. That's what the voice of God sounds like. That's really the best it's the best I can explain it. It's kind of like that. So for what it's worth, there it is. So I pointed out we can have a personal relationship with God. We can know God personally. He speaks to us personally. It's a relational thing. But even though God's voice is unique to each and every single one of us, there are some similarities and commonalities, right? Kind of like how a father speaks a little bit differently to each of his children because he knows them and he knows that they have different personalities. But when he speaks, there's a lot of similarities because it's still him speaking and it's still his voice, right? And so it's the same thing with God, right? So I want to give you just some general typical ways that he typically speaks to Christians, right? At least what I've discovered from my experience and my conversations with other people. It's not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it's a list that covers a pretty good range of the spectrum. So here's how God speaks. And I got to say this because people always ask me, specifically, Keith, tell me, specifically, how exactly do you hear his voice? So here's some of the ways here. One of the ways is the audible voice, right? This seems pretty obvious. This is kind of like the big one, right? This is the one that everyone desires. Oh, I want God to speak to me in the audible voice. But it's actually also one of the most rare ways he speaks, right? But we know from the Bible, yes, he does speak in audible voice, but it's very rare. In my estimation, only about 10 to 20% of Christians actually have ever heard or will ever hear the audible voice of God. And those that do hear it, most likely they've only ever going to hear it one time in their lives. So I know hearing from God is a personal thing, but I would love to just do a fun little experiment here. Humor me, please, if you will. I want you to put up your hand right now if you've ever heard the audible voice of God. Okay, just a quick experiment here. Okay, maybe about 15 or so people. Okay, so let's say we have 30. So it's a little bit less. Maybe that's about 5%. So maybe a little bit less than I estimated. Okay, so about 5% of people in this room have heard the audible voice of God. And maybe there's more, and maybe you're just shy. That's okay. But it proves to us something, right? It proves to us, one, God still speaks in an audible voice. You have witnesses here. And by the way, I put my hand up. I haven't heard the audible voice of God yet, but I just put it up so you would, anyways. But it proves to us one, he still speaks in this way, and two, yes, it is very rare. Only about 5% of the people in this room have actually heard that. So, secondly, another way that God speaks is through gentle whispers. Some people refer to this as promptings. And this is important to realize because a lot of people, this is a common misconception that they say, if God were to speak to me, I'm sure I would know it. Like he would speak to me in such a powerful, obvious way that there's no way I'd be able to deny that it was God. But I found this is often not the case. God usually speaks in very subtle, very gentle ways. I sometimes think of it like a butterfly that comes to rest on your hand here, right? You barely notice it, and at the slightest disturbance, it flies away and it's gone, right? It's so easy for us to ignore the gentle whisper of God. Maybe it's just like a very gentle check in our soul when we're about to sin. Or maybe someone who we haven't talked to or thought of in a long time, they just pop into our head. And it's because God wants us to pray for them or reach out to them, right? These things are very, very easy to ignore. But let me tell you this. If you choose to lean into those promptings, if you choose to even act on them, there's this whole realm of God's kingdom that just opens up before you that you never knew was there before. Right? This is the adventure I'm talking about, the living every day like a God adventure. Like, what do you want to say to me? When you start leaning into that voice of God, you start to be able to identify it more, and it opens up all these amazing ways that God is actually at work. Because remember, God is always at work around us, right? He's always at work. So that means that everything that's happening is potentially happening for a reason, and he might want to invite us into that, and that is an exhilarating thing. So I want to try just one more thing. Again, please humor me if you can, because the gentle whispers of God, the promptings of God, this is the most common way that God speaks to us. The audible voice is the least common way. The gentle whispers is the most common way. So if you've ever had or felt like God has spoken to you through a gentle whisper or prompting, please put your hand up. Okay, don't be shy. Take a second, keep your hand up, look around. That's almost everybody. You can put your hand down. Almost everyone in this room has heard from God in this way, which proves that it is one of the most common ways that God speaks to us. Now, a third way that God speaks to us is through dreams and visions. Now, it's really important when we start talking about dreams and visions to mention, as you probably guessed, not all dreams come from God, right? They can come from the enemy. They can come from your subconscious. Maybe you had a bad burrito the night before. I don't know, but dreams are funny, right? They can come from a lot of different sources, but they can also come from God. I remember for a long time in my Christian walk, I didn't believe that God still spoke this way. And one time, there was a Alliance pastor, an older pastor than me, more experienced, and he challenged me on this. And he challenged me to go to the Bible and actually see what it says about this. And when I did my own research, I discovered that if I wanted to disbelieve that God still speaks in dreams and visions, I would have to cut out huge chunks of my Bible, right? So I was convicted by that. I repented, and he suggested to me a book on Christian dream interpretation. So I bought the book, read the book, started keeping a dream journal, and I started praying to God and asking him to give me dreams and to speak to me through my dreams. And wouldn't you know, it wasn't long after I started doing that I got a prophetic supernatural dream from God. It's a dream that affected the course of my life, and I ended up using that as one of many aspects of hearing God's voice, which led me to make a very big life decision. And it was proven months after the fact in a way that no one could have known that it was indeed real and it was telling the future. I can't go into that. I don't have time for that today, but if you ever want to hear the story, come chat with me. I'll tell you the story. But God does still speak in dreams, my friends. Now, why does he do this? Well, I sort of jokingly reason sometimes that it's because the only time in the day that we shut up long enough that he can actually get our attention is when we're sleeping. Now, it might not be so true for you, but it's definitely true for me, right? I'm a pastor, so you get us talking, and there's no shutting us up. So God speaks to me in dreams. Maybe he does for you too. I didn't mention a lot about visions, but I should just mention really quick. Visions are basically dreams that you get when you're awake. So we often talk about dreams and visions together. The Bible often talks about them together. Yes, he still does speak to us today in visions. Just read the New Testament. It's there all over the place. That's one way that he speaks. So that's the third way he speaks, through dreams and visions. A fourth way he speaks, though, is to our body and to our emotions. Some people will claim that when God is hearing them, when God is speaking to them, they will feel warmth in their body, or they may feel heat in a certain part of their body. Maybe that needs healing, right? Some people, and this is my experience, will feel like an inner wind, like coursing throughout their body. Sometimes it takes your breath away or like gives you breath. It's kind of weird. Some people describe it like electricity that runs through your body, or some people will sometimes claim that they'll get like a pain in a certain part of their body, and it's because there's someone that they need to pray for that has that injury, and God wants to heal them, and so God's speaking to their body. So there's lots of ways, but probably I would say the most common way that God speaks in this area has to be by giving us his emotions, allowing us to feel what it is he's feeling. So case in point, I'm not a very empathetic person. Ask my wife, she'll tell you. Look at my personality tests. They'll all tell you the same thing. Keith is not an empathetic person, which means that I find it difficult to understand what other people are going through and what other people are feeling, right? But it's probably a good idea as a pastor to have some empathy. But God needs to help me in this area. So sometimes, I'm on the prayer team. And so after the service, you'll notice we have prayer people up here, and they can pray for you if you need prayer. And when I'm on the prayer team, I intentionally put up my God antenna, and I start listening to God and say, God, you got to help me. You got to speak to me. Help me to pray well. And what I've noticed is that when people come up to be prayed for and they start to share with me their concerns that they want to bring before the Lord, I will feel a deep sense of love and compassion for that person. Like I feel their hurt and pain. And I know that's not me, that's not my personality, that's not coming from me. But what's happening in that moment, and this is how I understand it, is that God is allowing me to feel what he feels for this person in that moment. He's allowing me to feel the compassion that he has for them. And it allows me to pray for them in such a deep, personal, sincere way, much more sincere than I ever would have been able to without God's help. And one of the, side effects of this that I didn't realize, but I've noticed over the years, is that I get to, for a moment, understand just how much God loves people, just how much he loves his children. And I go, if God loves that person that way, he must love me that way. And let me tell you, my friends, this can happen to you. He can give you a little taste of what he thinks about you and what he feels. God is a God of emotion, right? Emotion comes from him. He created it. He's a God of emotion. When he shares his emotion, that you understand what he feels about you, let me tell you, I hope you're seated when that happens, because it will bring you to your knees, and it's the most beautiful thing, And when God speaks to you that way, it is a gift of grace, and I'm ever so thankful whenever he chooses to do that in my own life. So, anyways, long story short, he speaks through emotions. But I need to say, last thing to say about emotions is when we talk about emotions, we have to say this, and that is emotions are particularly deceptive, my friends. So you got to watch it with your emotions. Not every emotion comes from God, and your emotions can be deceiving. So you got to test it. If you feel God speaking to your emotions, test that through his word, through his sovereign will, moral will, and of course through trusted, spirit-filled Christian friends that you trust. So that's a fourth way. A fifth way God speaks to us is through our mind's eye. Some people describe this as God speaking to or through our imagination. Those who tend to be very visual people, this is often how they will say that God speaks to them. So God does often speak to me this way. I'm a pretty visual guy. Just an example, one time I was at a conference several years ago, and I was on the prayer team, right? So I had my God antenna up. And a guy comes forth, and he wants prayer for healing, right? Stuff from his past, wounds, trauma. And so before I pray, thank the Lord for this, I had the wisdom to say, you know what, let's just wait a minute on the Lord. And let's ask him to give us some direction. So we sat in silence for maybe a minute. We started praying. And God began to basically play a video in my mind. And I saw there was a little boy, and he was swinging on a little metal swing. Could have been 6 or 7, and he's swinging on the swing, and it's in someone's backyard. I can tell it's in the summertime. Everything's green, it's lush. There's green grass, and as I'm describing this image, as I'm describing what I'm seeing in my mind's eye, the guy starts to get very emotional. He starts to break down, and what I found out later, he was breaking down because what God was showing me was the scene of a crime. It was the scene of something very terrible that happened to that man when he was a child at this person's house in this backyard. And it was God's way of telling him, I know, this is the hang-up, this is what's hurting you, and this is what I want to heal today. And so we were able to pray directly into that, and he got a significant amount of healing that day, and he knew what he had to go after. So yeah, I've experienced it. God can speak through your mind's eye. And the last way I'll touch on is God can speak to your spirit. Romans 8:16 says, the Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. The Spirit himself testifies with our spirit that we are God's children. Okay, this is like spirit-on-spirit communication, my friends. God can speak to you in such a way that you just know something. Like you just know what he's saying. Kind of like when you talk to someone, you say, how did you know she was the one? How did you know you were in love? And they'll say, I don't know, I just knew, Or how sometimes, you just know everything's going to be okay, despite all the evidence showing the opposite, right? You just know, right? So God can speak to your spirit, right? But again, I'll say it like I've said it before, this sermon is not standalone. You got to look at it through the lens of the other sermons and the foundation that Pastor Karen and Pastor Brent have laid out. And that is, when listening to God, we have to make sure there are those guardrails, right? He's never going to speak to you anything that's contrary to his word. He's always going to speak within his sovereign will, his moral will, and he'll speak through his community, right? The community of believers, which is the church. So you got to take that into account. But all that being said, right, all the caveats put in place, there is one other thing that you need to know that is so, so, so important when it comes to hearing God's voice, and that is this: surrender. Surrender. It's that simple. Surrender. God is our Father, and we can learn a lot from God from parenting, right? And it says right in John 10, verse 3, the sheep listen to his voice. Okay? They listen to the shepherd's voice. They listen to the Father's voice. And God is a father, and I'm a father. And sometimes I have to speak to my kids. And sometimes I'll tell them to do things that they don't want to do, but that's good for them. And when I tell them to do that, usually they will kind of drag their feet a bit, or they'll kind of ignore me. And then I'll go to them and I'll say, did you hear me? And they'll say, yeah, Dad, I heard you. And I'll say, yeah, you heard me, but you're not listening to me. Okay, in case you're wondering, yes, that's my dad voice right there. Yeah, I know you heard me, but are you listening to me? No, you're not listening to me. Okay, we know this, right? There's a big difference between hearing and between listening, right? Huge difference. And what I have found is that it's difficult to hear God until we're willing to listen to God. Let me say that again. It's difficult to hear God until we're willing to listen to God. Or maybe it's the fact, I don't know how this exactly works, it's the spiritual realm, it's confusing, but maybe he chooses to withhold his voice until he knows we're ready to actually listen. And then he speaks to us. Or maybe we're just, I don't know, maybe we're just ignoring him. Who knows? But George Mueller, he's a guy that lived in the 1800s. He was a very famous, very well-known Christian man. He was known to be someone who lived absolutely under the guidance of God all the time, right? He famously wrote one of the first discernment processes down on paper. It's been used for hundreds of years by Christians to discern the will of God. He's known for having built a huge series of orphanages from no money. He had no money, no resources, no experiences, no connections, and he simply prayed, listened to God, followed his will, and he built this huge, huge orphanage. And he did it and recorded all of it through his journals. You can get them free online, really amazing stuff. But this is what he famously had to say on this subject of receiving guidance from God. He says, I seek at the beginning to get my heart into such a state that it has no will of its own in regard to a given matter. 9/10 of the trouble with people generally is just here. 9/10 of the difficulties are overcome when our hearts are ready to do the Lord's will, whatever it may be. When one is truly in this state, it is usually but a little way to the knowledge of what his will is. Listen, my friends, I've known lots of people that very well in my life that, they need to make a decision in their life and they want to seek God's guidance. But I know, as well as they know, they made up their mind a long time ago. And that even if God were to speak to them, they're probably just going to do whatever they want anyways, right? And Pastor Brent told me, he told me this week. I want you to listen to it. This is a great quote. I don't know where he got it, but it really summarizes this well. God doesn't reveal his will for our consideration, but for our participation. God doesn't reveal his will for our consideration, but for our participation. I often describe it to people like this. I'll say, imagine someone comes up to you and they say, listen, I want you to do something for me, okay? But I need you to say yes before I tell you what it is. Now, would you do that? Sometimes I think this is how God deals with us. He goes, I want to tell you something, but I need you to say yes before you do it. Why does he operate like that? It is because I think he desires real trust and real obedience. Now, there is one person in this world, other than God, that if they were to ask me that question, I would say yes to without hesitation. And that's my wife, Lacey Jo, right? Now, why is this? It is because I trust her without reservation. She has earned my trust. I trust emphatically that she loves me, that she cares for me, that she is for me, and she only wants what's best for me. I have no question about that. So I'd gladly say yes to her. And this is exactly, I think, what the trust and surrender to God looks like, and the trust and surrender that God requires from us if we are to really hear him. But the interesting thing is that other than Lacey, God is the only one I'll ever say yes to before knowing what it is. And that's because he also has earned my trust. In fact, God has a leg up on my wife because he was willing to die for me on a cross. If anyone is ever willing to voluntarily die for you, suffer for you in your place unto death, that person, my friends, that person is trustworthy. You can trust a God who bleeds for you. You can easily surrender to a God who first surrendered everything he could for you. My friends, that's what God has done for you. He's earned your trust. You can trust him. You can say yes to him before you even know what he's going to ask of you, because you know that whatever he asks of you is for your good. And if he asks you to give something up, he'll always replace it with something more and more valuable.
Thanks for listening to this week's message from Spruce Grove Alliance Church. For more information or to hear past messages, please visit sgac.net.